Once you've defeated Calus and explored the neon streets of Neomuna, you may want to tackle Destiny 2 Lightfall's new raid, Root of Nightmares, which sends you and 5 friends to the Witness's pyramid ship to take on the final god of pain, Nezarec. But overcoming the mechanics-heavy endgame activity can be a challenging feat if you don't know what to do, so we've put together a guide on how to tear out these nightmares by the root.
You've arrived. Good.
Before we go through each encounter, let's talk about the main mechanic introduced in Root of Nightmares, gardening, which you'll see in nearly every encounter this raid throws at you. The gardening mechanic involves nodes, also called seeds of light or darkness. Light nodes are round and have a white-bluish glow, while dark nodes are spiraled ovals and have a black and orange hue. Nodes have 4 possible states: active, primed, completed, and inert. Active nodes have large orbs encased in an AoE bubble, indicating that the node will give off a buff when shot. Once you've done so and gained the Field of Light or Flux of Darkness buff, you'll want to look for the corresponding primed node. Luckily, active nodes also have a beam of light that points in the direction of the primed node they connect to. Follow it, and you'll find the correct primed node in no time. Primed nodes have a helix of particles surrounding a small orb, indicating it can be grown into a completed node when a player carrying the corresponding buff shoots it. You'll want to seek these out when carrying the right buff so you can create the next completed node in the chain. Completed nodes are large orbs that, unlike active nodes, have no AoE bubble, indicating that they've successfully received the buff effect and have gone from the primed node state to their final finished form. But since they don't have the AoE bubble that's found in active nodes, they cannot be used to give off a buff when shot. However, they do have a beam of light like active nodes, which points in the direction of the next node in the chain. This means you'll want to use them to figure out which direction you can find to the next primed node right after you shoot them. Previous completed or active nodes will continue to point wherever they were pointing previously, which means they're no longer useful if you've already completed that node. Finally, there are inert nodes, which have a double helix of particles but no orb, indicating that they cannot yet be interacted with. Ignore any of these you see until they become primed, but it's a good idea to remember their locations since all nodes will need to be completed to advance each encounter that makes use of them. To complete the encounters and puzzles involving these nodes, players will need to grab a buff from one active node and bring it to the primed node of the same type, matching Flux of Darkness with dark nodes and Field of Light with light nodes, until every node has been completed. Every time you shoot a primed node while carrying the correct buff, you will lose that buff, meaning you'll need to go back to an active node and shoot it again while standing in the bubble to regain it. Then, find the next primed node and repeat this process until no primed or inert nodes remain. If you or someone else on the team shoots the wrong node or makes some kind of mistake involving them, a message that reads, "Nodes of Splendor have been disrupted," will appear in the combat log, and all nodes will disappear for a period of time, wasting precious seconds needed to complete the ritual. Each encounter that makes use of the gardening mechanic will require 1 or 2 players, dubbed gardeners, to dedicate themselves solely to completing it, while everyone else kills enemies and takes care of any other mechanics necessary to complete the encounter or trigger a damage phase. And with that, let's dive in. The opening moments of Root of Nightmares are pretty straightforward, as you'll fight a handful of enemies and explore ahead into the first encounter. Along the way, there will be some lore pieces for you to find, and, as with last year's Vow of the Disciple raid, an optional puzzle to solve that will grant you an additional loot drop at the raid's conclusion, which guarantees a raid weapon with deep sight resonance, very useful if you're hoping to eventually craft some of these raid weapons. The optional puzzle can be found before the raid's first encounter, by hugging the left wall as you explore. After a short time, you'll find a small altar of flora with 3 glowing seeds inside it, which will either be light or dark. By reading the seeds from left to right, these seeds can be interpreted as a passcode that must be entered in order to acquire the extra loot drop. If you're hoping to get the extra loot, you'll want to take a picture or remember the color of each of these seeds, as you'll need to match the passcode exactly to claim it. Before the first and after the second and third encounter, you'll be able to find hidden nodes, which can be activated using the gardening mechanic. You'll want to activate the node that matches the seed 1, 2, and 3 in order. For example, before the first encounter, you'll find the secret nodes hiding down some stairs that are off the beaten path. You should grab the buff from the active node and bring it to the primed node that matches the color of the first seed in your sequence. Doing so correctly will trigger a message in the combat log that reads, "Your actions take root." If you slip up and activate the wrong seed, it will tell you, "Your spoils suffer irreparable damage." If you're able to get the former response 3 times in the raid, you'll get an additional message saying, "A great harvest awaits," which means you've completed the optional puzzle and will receive extra loot once you've completed the raid. None of this is necessary to complete the raid, so I won't be showing where to find these hidden nodes here, but this is an easy and fun way to earn some extra prizes for all your hard work. Plus, searching for the hidden nodes in between each raid encounter is a fun way to spend your time. And with that, let's kick off our first encounter, Cataclysm. This encounter has no boss or damage phase to contend with. Instead, players must complete a simple ritual and kill whole armies of enemies to advance. First, you'll need to designate a gardener, who will complete the encounter's gardening mechanic by using active nodes to shoot primed nodes until all the nodes are complete. I recommend only having one person do this, although you can add a second if your fire team is having trouble completing the ritual in time. Everyone else will focus on killing ads and completing a separate minor ritual to buy the gardener more time. Enemies spawn at a very high rate in this encounter, and can make the job of the gardener much more deadly if they're not taken care of, so it's important the rest of the team thin the enemies' numbers as much as possible. As they do so, the group will be looking for 2 Scion enemies that spawn throughout the area encased in bubbles, signified by the combat log notification, "An adherent of Torment has appeared." The players will need to lay into them with a melee attack to kill them as quickly as possible. Once both Scions are dead, a Tormentor enemy will spawn on the left or right side of the map, and must be killed before the sweeping terror counter goes to 0. Start by shooting the Tormentor's shoulders before moving on to their chest. Once they're dead, more time will be added to the countdown clock, and the process will happen again, going on this way until the gardener has completed all the nodes available to them. Ad clearing players should also keep an eye out for a barrier Colossus that spawns alongside each Tormentor, who can slow guardians down with blinding rockets, including the gardener, and get someone killed. To complete the encounter, the gardener will need to complete 4 separate chains of nodes, each one a little farther up the map than the last. During each phase, the rest of the players will need to kill as many Scions and Tormentors as required to give the gardener enough time to complete their job. If you're having trouble remembering where nodes, Scions, or Tormentors are located, or are confused by the layout of the map in general, take a look at this map, which details everything you need to know to master this encounter. Shout out to Destiny Raid Secrets Reddit user Pryony for creating these topographical maps, which are incredibly useful visual aids for you and your fire team to familiarize yourself with each encounter. I'll be relying on community-made maps for each encounter. Once the gardener has completed all 4 phases worth of nodes, the encounter will end and you'll get your first loot drop. Congratulations, but don't get cocky, this is only the beginning. The second encounter in Root of Nightmares begins when you arrive at a large multi-floored area separated by one giant gap. To complete this encounter, you'll need to divide the group into 2 teams of 3, one for each side of the gap, and each group needs to designate 1 gardener and 2 ad clearers. Starting at the first floor, the goal of each side's gardener is to activate all 6 nodes they're responsible for, 6 light and 6 dark. The twist is, the active nodes are always on the opposite side of the gap as the next corresponding primed node, which means you'll need to make use of the spring-loaded man cannons that can be found on each side. After the gardeners grab the buffs of light or darkness on their side, the beam of light will indicate to the next node in the chain on the opposite side of the gap. Head over to the man cannon, stand in front of it, and shoot the floating diamond in front of you to be thrown across. But be warned, these cannons can be a bit unpredictable, and sometimes you'll be thrown in a way that will cause you to fall to your death if you aren't prepared. I recommend pressing the jump button shortly after you're launched in the air to account for an unexpected trajectory. Once you're on the other side, you can shoot the primed node, then head back to the other side to regain your buff. The next node in the chain will be on the side you came from originally, where you collect the buff. So you can shoot your primed node quickly, go back to your buff again, and then launch yourself across the gap again to shoot your third primed node. Keep doing this until all of the nodes in your chain have been completed, keeping in mind that your active node will change as you progress, so keep an eye out for which one carries the buff. I should also mention that there's a more efficient method for the gardeners to complete this encounter, though it can be a bit tricky to comprehend. In this alternate version, instead of each gardener being responsible for just the nodes in their chain, they take one another's buff every time they cross, shoot the primed node on their side, then grab the opposite buff again and cross the gap to shoot the next one, before returning to their original chain. The advantage here is that it saves time and halves the number of times each gardener has to fling themselves across the perilous gap. So, for example, if you start as the Darkness Gardener, you'd grab Flux of Darkness, cross the gap and shoot the first primed node in your chain, then go to the Light active node and get the Field of Light buff, and shoot the Light primed node on your side. Then, go back, grab the Field of Light buff again, cross the gap again, and shoot the next prime node in the chain. Then, swap back to your original chain and grab the Flux of Darkness again and continue. Because the Light Gardener is doing the same, you've now completed twice as many nodes in the chain while only crossing the gap twice, and have saved valuable time in the process. But it's a little confusing. Meanwhile, the two ad-clearing guardians on each side will need to kill enemies and stay close to whichever node on their side is active. That's because they'll also need the Flux of Darkness or Field of Light buff to kill certain shielded enemies on each side. Each time a gardener approaches the active node to gain the buff, they should make sure that the ad-clearing guardians on that side are in the area of effect of the active node before shooting it. Once they have the buff, they can go kill things before returning the next time their active node is ready to be shot. Though they should make sure to never shoot any of the nodes themselves in the process. Once the node chains on each side have been completed, a final wave of enemies will spawn, which can only be killed by those carrying Flux of Darkness or Field of Light. If players need the buff again, they can shoot any completed node without worrying about breaking anything, since the sequence has already been completed. Once the enemies on both sides have been cleared, players can stand in front of the final man cannon together and shoot the diamond to launch everyone to the next floor. The process then has to be completed 2 more times on 2 more floors, with little changing between each floor. The key is in the gardeners doing their work as quickly as possible and not disrupting the nodes. If you take too long, the imminent expulsion counter will go to 0 and launch all players to their deaths with prejudice. If you need help understanding the layout of each floor, review this diagram for a great overview. Make sure everyone is keeping the buffs they need at all times, let the gardeners lead callouts, and you'll make it through the top floor in no time. Once you've beaten the second encounter, you're on to the jumping puzzle, though this one is less of a puzzle and more of a relay race. The objective is simple: explore until you reach the end of the area while avoiding death at the hands of a pulse of energy that happens about every 30 seconds. To protect yourself from the pulse of death, you'll need to shoot one of the light active nodes to get the Field of Light buff, then go to a dark completed node to turn that Field of Light buff into a Darkness's Refuge buff. So long as you've got Darkness's Refuge, you won't be killed by the pulse of energy and can freely explore. There are plenty of light and dark nodes to find, and they're all in active and completed states respectively, so players can freely shoot nodes and work through the area at their own pace. This is also the area where the second node can be found for the extra loot drop we discussed earlier, as well as a secret chest for those who love exploration.
Tear that useless sack of meat apart from me, won't you?
It's time for the first boss fight of Root of Nightmares, Zoark, Explicator of Planets. The first thing you're likely to notice when entering the room for this encounter are the planets hovering overhead. Instead of relying on the gardening mechanics found in every other encounter, fighting Zoark requires moving these celestial bodies in a specific way to trigger the damage phase. The room has 4 large triangle platforms alongside the walls of the room. To move the planets, you'll need to assign one Guardian to each platform, with the remaining 2 staying in the middle on ad clearing duty. Shortly after starting the encounter, 2 Cabal Chieftains will spawn in the middle platform and should immediately be killed by the 2 Guardians assigned to clearing ads. Once they're killed, a powerful Colossus enemy called a Terrestrial Lieutenant will spawn on each platform, which should immediately be killed by the person assigned to that platform. When a Terrestrial Lieutenant is killed, the Guardian who dealt the final blow will gain a buff called Planetary Insight, so it's important that no one kill this enemy except for the player assigned to that platform. Planetary Insight allows the holder to see the planets above said platform as either dark or light. Those on the left side of the room will always have 2 light and 1 dark planet associated with their platform, while those on the right side of the room will always have 2 dark and 1 light. In order to trigger the damage phase, the players on the left side must swap the odd planet out with their counterpart on the opposite side of the room. To do this, you should call out which of your planets doesn't match the other 2, then pick up the orb that can be found directly below that planet. By communicating with the player across the room, travel to their platform and dunk that orb into the spot that they have identified, and have them do the same in return on your side. This encounter in particular can be a bit confusing to navigate without callouts, so here's a visual aid provided by Destiny Raid Secrets Reddit user Joe Gibbons. Thanks, Joe. Once all 4 of the planet swappers have swapped planets, they should return to their original platforms and wait for their planets to move, which will happen a couple seconds after all orbs have been dunked. If you moved the planets correctly, you'll see a notification in the combat log that says, "The indexed planets reveal themselves," and you'll advance to the next step of the encounter. If you fail, the planets will move back to their original positions and you'll need to attempt the phase again. Once all planets have been moved to their correct spot, more chieftains will spawn and must be killed by the ad-clearing guardians in the middle of the room. As before, doing so will spawn terrestrial lieutenants, which should be killed by each of their respective planet swappers. Once the planet swappers have the planetary insight buff, they should turn their attention to the center of the room, where a triangle of planets will now be glowing with darkness or light. For the final step before damage phase, planet swappers must coordinate grabbing 3 orbs to match the color combination of the planets in the center of the room, and dunking them in the corresponding trio of plates in the central platform. So for example, if there are 2 darkness planets in the left and right corners of the triangle, then both of the dark side players must grab an orb from their side and dunk it onto the left and right plates. Meanwhile, one Guardian on the left side needs to grab a light orb to dunk it on the center plate. There will always be 2 planets in one color and a single planet in the opposite color, so you'll always need to call upon 3 people to handle dunking of orbs. The 4th planet swapper can move to the middle platform early and help mop up enemies before the damage phase. If you didn't dunk the orbs correctly, chieftains will spawn and you'll have to try again. But if you did it correctly, the planets will align themselves, signaling the start of the damage phase. The damage phase is divided into 3 mini phases, where the boss's shield will either be orange or white, signaling that he can only be damaged by guardians who are standing on the plate with the same glow of his shield. So, if his shield starts glowing orange, everyone needs to move onto the same orange plate to damage him. After a few seconds, he'll become immune and toss a fire tornado at you, and his shield will change color, meaning everyone should shift to a different plate to match that color. After all plates have been used up, the damage phase will end, and everyone should return to their original positions to begin the planetary alignment again. You have a maximum of 3 opportunities to trigger the damage phase, and so will need to make it count. If you do enough damage, Zoark will enter his last stand phase, where he'll gain another colored shield and send a flurry of fire tornadoes after you. All players should stand on a plate of the corresponding color and throw every ounce of DPS at him and watch him explode. And now we've made it to the final encounter, Nezarec, the final god of pain. After a super dope spawning animation, your team will need to complete a ritual involving nodes of darkness and light to beat Root of Nightmares once and for all. For this encounter, we'll be dividing the team into 3 groups of 2, Gardeners, Hatred Holders, and Ad Clearers. First, let's talk about the Gardeners. Similar to the second encounter, 2 gardeners will each be responsible for completing their chain of nodes, with light nodes on the left and dark nodes on the right. The starting active nodes will always be the same, but beyond that, you'll need to rely on beams of light to guide you to the next primed node to be shot while carrying the corresponding buff. Once all 6 on each side have been shot, the damage phase will begin. The trick is that, in the middle of this process, unless your team is extremely fast, Nezarec will trigger a wipe mechanic that will kill your whole team unless you have the correct buff. I recommend preparing for this wipe mechanic after 3 or 4 nodes have been completed. To survive the wipe mechanic, the 2 hatred holders will need to shoot Nezarec's shoulders until a burst of energy emanates off of him, which will either be light or dark. If the energy burst is light, the dark side gardener will need to stop what they're doing, grab the Flux of Darkness buff from their own active node, travel to a completed light node on the opposite side of the map, and shoot it to create a shielding buff for any guardians who pass through the area. If the energy burst is dark, the light side gardener will need to do the same, but on the dark side of the map. Just make sure that you're using a completed node to do this, not the active node, or you'll disrupt the nodes and die. The shielding effect lasts only a handful of seconds, so guardians may need to pass through the area multiple times if they grab it too early ahead of the wipe mechanic. Once the safety buff node has been created and all guardians have gained the buff by passing through the area, they'll be safe when Nezarec releases a pulse of energy that would normally kill everyone. Then everyone can pick up where they left off and continue pushing through to the damage phase. Next, let's talk about the hatred holders, who will spend their time in the center of the map and wait for Nezarec's shoulders to glow. When they do, both players should shoot them until they break, then call out which color explosion they see for the guardians to take note and create the corresponding shielding effect. After that, hatred holders should turn their attention to Nezarec's chest, which will also glow once it can be damaged. By doing a moderate amount of damage to the boss's chest, the hatred holders can gain a debuff called Nezarec's Hatred, which will force Nezarec off his platform to chase the object of his hate. Doing so is necessary because if left unchecked, Nezarec will begin killing players with a homing attack that's impossible to dodge. Once one hatred holder has gained Nezarec's Hatred, they'll want to keep their distance from the boss and count down how many seconds left they have on the debuff. After they do, the other hatred holder should shoot Nezarec's chest to take the debuff for themselves and take the heat off of the first player. They should continue this process until it's time for damage phase. While doing so, it's important to try and keep Nezarec contained to the center of the arena, as if he's allowed to wander to the sides, he can cause serious disruption to the gardeners, who can't afford to make mistakes. Finally, there's the ad clearers, who should each be assigned to either the left or right side and take care of enemies as quickly as possible, especially the Colossus enemies that spawn and can slow everyone down with homing rockets. They'll also want to turn their attention to the center of the arena to help clear ads there as well, who can make life very difficult for the hatred holders if they aren't killed quickly. If you're having trouble understanding the layout of the level, here's another topographical diagram provided by our friend Pryony. If the gardeners on each side are allowed to complete their nodes, then you'll enter Nezarec's damage phase, where everyone can stop what they're doing and gather on one of the node pads to await the phases begin. After a few seconds, Nezarec will be hit by a beam of light and will become damageable. Start laying into him with your heavy weapons as he jumps around and performs dope melee animations, and after a significant period of time, he'll become immune again and you'll repeat the process. As with the previous encounter, you'll have a maximum of 3 phases to bring Nezarec to his last stand, at which point you'll have one last damage check to bring his health to 0 and claim victory. Congratulations, Guardian. You've beaten the final god of pain and shown the enemies of humanity what for. For more on Bungie's beloved looter shooter, check out our review of Destiny 2 Lightfall. And for everything else, stick with IGN.
My memory will never extinguish. In your calmest moments, your deepest slumber, you will remember me, Guardian.